Well, when I was a kid, I read this story, The Great God Pan, which was about bringing somebody back to life. That story sort of stayed with me my whole life. And I thought to myself, I'd like to sort of write something about that someday. And then I wrote Joyland, which was about carnivals, and I started to think about the relationship between carnies and the revival circuit. And I'd always wanted to write a story about the revival circuit and about somebody who was a healer on that circuit, because when I grew up, Oral Roberts was on TV and he'd say, come on up and be healed, and he'd pull tumors out of people and say, get up and walk, and people would get up and walk. And you knew it was a little bit on the sketchy side there, but it was really interesting to me. And I thought, what if somebody could really do that, if there was a way to do that? So at some point, and I can never remember exactly where, because all the stories seem almost like dreams to me once they're done. It kind of fades away, the whole process of creation. But I decided that I wanted to try to combine a lot of those elements into a story. And also I wanted to bring in a little bit of that Frankenstein idea, because, as a kid, probably you remember this, the idea of applying electricity to the dead person, and Igor would say, Master, it's alive, it's alive. So I wanted to try to bring all that in. He's a good-hearted man. Yeah. He grows up in a big family that was sort of modeled on the families that I grew up with. The ones that I saw where there was a mom and dad in the house and a lot of kids, and everybody would brawl in after school, and grab peanut butter cookies, or there'd be a cake on the table or something like that. And we might watch American Bandstand, or we might just go out and play in the woods. But I loved that. I loved being welcomed into families where there was a real complete balanced family. We had a nice family, but there was no dad in the picture. There was just my brother and my mother and me. So I kind of looked at that, and I really wanted to create a family environment that would feel like they were welcoming people in, because if I have any kind of a strategy as a writer of suspense or scary stories, it's that we ought to start in the daylight where everybody feels welcome, and you come on in and it's kind of like a warm place. And then little by little, I want to lead you into the dark when you're too deep into the story to get away. It's a little sadistic, but it's kind of fun too. There was no rationale. You go where the story leads you. And in this case, I had no idea it was going to have a dark conclusion. You were mentioning before we got going Salem's Lot. And when I started that story, I thought to myself, well, this will be the opposite of Dracula, where the good guys win. In this book, the good guys are going to lose, and everybody's going to become a vampire at the end of the book. And that didn't happen, because you go where the book leads you, and this one just led me into a very dark place. I didn't even want to go there. I want people to find it out for themselves. You never know. You never know. And sometimes it's a big and powerful machine. The best description of writing a novel that I ever heard is actually in Thomas Williams's book, The Hair of Harold Rue, which is about a novelist trying to write a novel. And it just covers like 1 or 2 days in this process, and a lot of things happen to him. It's a fabulous book. But he says that writing a novel is like building a little campfire on an empty, dark plain. And one by one, these characters come out of the dark, and each one has a little pile of wood, and they put it on the fire. And if you're very lucky, before the fire goes out, it's this big bonfire, and all the characters stand around it and warm themselves. And that's the way it's always been for me. I have a good friend over in Vermont, John Irving. And John says that he always begins a novel by writing the last line. And to me, that's like eating your dessert before you eat the meal. And everybody works a different way. And God bless John, and he's done some wonderful work. in his lifetime, and he'll probably do some more, but I could never write a book that way. The way that I think of it, you know, is that fire. I love that particular image, but I've also always thought of it in terms of there's a little thread, a little red thread that goes into a hole in the baseboard, and you just start to pull it out, and you see what's on the other end of it, and sooner or later you get there. For me, the fun of writing novels isn't in the finished product, which I don't care about that much. There's a guy who was looking at my shelf over there. All the books are on the shelf, and to me those are like dead skin, the things that are done. But I love the process. I tell the story to myself, and in a way, when the work is the best work, it's more like being a secretary than it is a creative person. You just sort of take this stuff down. Well, I was very lucky after the accident because I felt like I was done because I was in a lot of pain. And when you're in that situation, you don't feel much like writing. At the time of the accident, I had a book called On Writing that was about 3/4 done. And my wife, who's very wise, a lot of times she'll say to me, you need to slow down, you need to take time off to enjoy all the good things in life that your good fortune is provided for you. And she knew after that accident that what I really needed to do to find my way back was to work. So she set up a little writing area off the hallway here in Bangor, and I used to crutch out every day and sit down, and I finished that book. But when it was done, I thought to myself, I really don't have any interest in writing anything else. I had ideas, but the actual physical work of doing it, of sitting down and spending that time in that position, because everything was kind of smashed up below the waist, it seemed like too much work to me. And so I did an interview with the Los Angeles Times, and I said, I'm thinking about retirement, because I was. But the body's an amazing thing, and little by little, it healed itself. And when that happened, and I started to get some energy back, I wanted to write again. So I've been fortunate. It isn't the same way that it used to be when I was 25. When I had so many ideas in my head, I felt like it was exploding half the time. It was like somebody had yelled fire in a crowded room, and everybody crams into the doorway at once, all these different ideas. Now, if I have 2 or 3 ideas kind of like in the back of my mind, I'm happy. That's enough. I've lost a few miles an hour, that's right, and that's a good metaphor for it. I've found in my later years a lot more I've had to go to the slider and the changeup. But I can still bring it when I really have to. You know, I'm old, but I'm not dead, so I can still wind up in fire. And I think that, you know, one of the things behind Revival was to say to people who really like books like Pet Sematary and The Shining, I wanted to see if I could still bring a real scare to people and write the sort of book where people would say, it's a great story, but it scared the hell out of me and I had to keep the lights on. I was sort of aiming for that in particular. So Revival is a fastball. There are a few guys in baseball fortunate enough to be able to bring it late in their career. Roger Clemens was one, and Nolan Ryan was another one. And I'd like to be that kind of a writer who's still able to bring a fastball. I don't know. I mean, I'm not terribly frustrated. I mean, obviously, I'm a season ticket holder, and I'm a little bit irritated that I spend X number of dollars and I see a team that can't hit the ball, okay? And that is, I'll admit it, a little bit frustrating, you know, to see all these games that the Red Sox lost by a run because they couldn't get the key hit at the key time. But when you look at it, 2012 was an awful season, and 2014 was an awful season. We actually won more games this year than we did when Bobby Valentine was manager in 2012. But in 2013, what happens? At the start of the season, they get off to a good start. That was number one. And then those idiots, those murderous idiots, blew up the Boston Marathon, and it shook up the city. And, you know, David Ortiz was asked about it, and on Father's Day or something, and he made that famous comment, "This is our bleeping city." And it fired up everybody, and it fired up the team, and they played way above their heads in 2013. We won the World Series, which was terrific. So we'll see what happens next year, but if you were to ask me to look ahead, I'd say you might have a postseason quality team again in 2016. It won't be next year, I don't think. The major thing is, in my house, sadness reigns because the Red Sox are done for the year. You know, you just get into the habit of, you're going to sit down in front of the TV at night, you know, with a book, and you're going to hear Don and Jerry, and it's just sort of comfortable. It's New England to me, and it's gone now. I love it. I've got a Kindle, and I've got an iPad with the iTunes store on it, where I can download a lot of books to the iPad, and also audiobooks. I was listening to an audiobook on my iPad on the way over here. I like the electronic books for the traditional reasons. The idea that I'm living out there in Western Maine a lot of the time. The nearest bookstore is 18 miles away, and believe me, we support it. We buy a lot of what they call P-books now, you know, paper books. But I like the idea of being able to push a button and boom, it's there. If you want something and you want the immediate satisfaction of that book, you can get it. But the other thing, and I don't know if a lot of people talk about this, but it's easier for me a lot of times to read because I can set the print size bigger and my eyes aren't what they used to be. Also, another thing, I just finished this pretty good spy novel called I Am Pilgrim, and it's like 700 pages long. It's a brick. And so I downloaded it to my iPad. I had the actual book, but I downloaded it to the iPad, and it's thin and it's easy to carry around. But I don't like the idea that the booksellers, that one bookseller like Amazon should have so much power over the market. Yeah. It makes me uneasy. Yeah. If you go to Amazon, most of the books you can get on the Kindle immediately, but if you want an actual hardcover book, it will say, it'll take us 3 weeks to deliver this book, which is just ridiculous because they could do it in a day. They pick those particular books so that Amazon seems to be holding some writers hostage. And I mean, the writers are the guys that made Amazon what they are, and it seems unfair that they should be the ones who are the real victims here. Well, you know, originally paperbacks back in the 40s were called pocketbooks because you could slip one into your back pocket and carry it around. And people who are like truck drivers and that sort of thing, their books always had a certain look. They were bent because they were against their butt. Yep. You know, the whole time. And a book like The Stand, can you imagine putting that in your back pocket? You'd give yourself a hemorrhoid. I'm amazed and very proud of both the boys. And you're right, Joe can really write scary fiction. Nosferatu and the first book, Heart-Shaped Books, are really terrifying in some ways. And if he learned anything from the old man, he learned that the way to really scare people is to make readers care about the characters. The characters seem really real, so that when they get into trouble, when they get into a situation that scares them, it scares you. So, but Owen is a terrifically accomplished writer, and he's got a sense of humor that he gets from me and from his mother, and that shows up in the books. And he's very different from Joe, but he's also really, really good at what he does. He's a great storyteller. I think they get that from both sides of the family, because Tab's written 7 books, and she's got this terrific grasp of what it's like to live in Maine. I mean, we're both Maine people, and we both have some of that, but Tabby grew up in Old Town, and she was a storekeeper's daughter, and a lot of that shows up in the fiction, and then it shows up in Owen's fiction as well. Naomi is managing, our daughter is managing an orchard that we own in Western Maine, in Sweden, called Pie Tree. You guys should go out there immediately, right away. Pie Tree Orchard, Sweden, Maine. Apples are great this time of year. And she's doing a terrific job, and the place is a roaring success because she's brought in a lot of innovations. So we're terrifically proud of her, and she's also a good writer when she wants to. It's just not, she wasn't drawn the same way as the boys. And we never ever pushed them and said, this is what we do, therefore it's what we want you to do. And that always makes me nervous when parents say, well, you should be a lawyer, you should be a doctor, you should do this or the other thing. I think kids should, you know, choose what it is that they want to do. But our house was full of books everywhere, and so they were, and we read to them from an early age, so they kind of grew up in that environment.